I started off this series on the downfall of the intellectual dark web by discussing Sam Harris and Eric Weinstein, probably the two most obvious and easy to lampoon targets in the IDW. Sam Harris is an atheist except when it comes to Zionism in Israel, who argued information such as Hunter Biden's laptop should be censored from the public if it would have assisted in keeping Donald Trump out of office. Meanwhile, Eric Weinstein, another atheist rationalist except when it comes to advocating for Israel, proved to be someone whose analysis was completely hollow and extremely weak to criticism or dissenting opinions. My next video on Ben Shapiro, and while it's clear to most people, except neocons, what sort of person Ben is, this video was more challenging in breaking down Ben's history of advocating for wars in the Middle East and his contradictory values of advocating for colourblind meritocracy for the US, but ethno-nationalism for Israel. This video would also spell a sort of point of no return for my YouTube channel, and probably forever cap my channel at least less than 10k subscribers by virtue of the topics I discuss in it. Although the series was incomplete, I hadn't really planned on making one on Jordan Peterson. For his numerous flaws, he was a force of nature back in 2016 and was a trailblazer in advocating for young men to stand up for themselves in the wave of cultural nihilism, feminism and anti-men propaganda. Peterson came across as a decent man standing up for what is right, more than capable of handling himself in debates, and someone who at the time genuinely had the best interest in society's most lost men at heart.
Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. And you saw that in the Pinocchio story, right? That's Pleasure Island. It's like, well, why lift a load if there's nothing in it for you? That's another thing that we're doing to men that's a very bad idea. And to boys. It's like, you're pathological and oppressive. It's like, fine then, why the hell am I going to play? If that's the situation, if I get no credit for bearing responsibility, you can bloody well be sure I'm not going to bear any. But then, you know, your life is useless and meaningless.
Cut forward 9 years later and Peterson is sitting down with Benjamin Netanyahu, shilling for Israel, working for Ben Shapiro at the Daily Wire, calling the same young men he once advocated for sociopathic rats, and has had his pseudo-Christian identity grift exposed for all to see, penning a paper with a number of Jewish people, calling the phrase Christ is King anti-Semitic. So yeah, I think it's time to make the video. Born in 1962 in Fairview, Alberta, Canada, Peterson grew up in a small rural town on the western edge of the Canadian wilderness. From an early age, he demonstrated an insatiable curiosity about human behaviour, literature, religion and history, interests that he would later define his life's work. He completed his PhD in clinical psychology at McGill University and subsequently moved to the United States to serve as a professor at Harvard University, where he garnered a reputation as a dynamic lecturer and fascinating thinker. In 1998, Peterson returned to Canada and joined the University of Toronto as a tenured professor, continuing to explore the structure of belief systems, personality and the psychology of meaning. That same year he published his first book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, a dense interdisciplinary work that explored how myths and narrative shapes our understanding of good and evil, order and chaos. While it received modest academic attention at the time, the ideas within it would soon become central to his public identity. Some might say a lot of Peterson's work was somewhat derivative of far more better renowned men such as Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche. However, it's undeniable in the utility of Peterson in this sense, acting as a funnel for a lot of young men onto these more capable philosophers, for lack of a better term. Throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, Peterson quietly built a loyal following through his lectures and appearances, both in classrooms and online. His lectures posted to YouTube, particularly on topics like Jungian psychology, mythology, and the meaning of life, began attracting attention from viewers looking for thoughtful discussions outside of mainstream academia. Peterson, before his blow-up, would make the occasional appearance on television, one with his daughter Michaela, and more about her later. By 2015, Peterson was not yet a household name, but he was already sowing the seeds of his public influence, deeply concerned about what he perceived as growing authoritarianism in political correctness and compelled speech, especially in academic and legal contexts. He began speaking more candidly about the dangers of ideological possession. His critiques were not based on partisanship, but on psychological principles, warning that any ideology, left or right, can devolve into tyranny when it silences dissent and complexity.
I just don't understand how it gets to the point where
things get to terrible places one tiny step at a time. You know, if I encroach on you and I'm sophisticated about it, I'm going to encroach 2 millimeters. I'm going to encroach right to the point where you start to protest. Then I'm going to stop. Then I'm going to wait. Then you're going to calm down. Then I'm going to encroach again, right to the point where you protest. Then I'm going to stop. Then I'm going to wait. And I'm just going to do that forever. And before you know it, you're going to be back 3 miles from where you started, and you'll have done it one step at a time. And then you'll go, oh, how'd I get here? And the answer was, well, I pushed you a little farther than you should have gone, and you agreed. And so then I pushed you a little farther than you should have gone again, and you agreed.
That year, he began uploading a series of videos warning against legislative proposals in Canada that he believed would compel speech, particularly around gender identity. Though the controversy has not yet erupted, the stage was set for the explosion of public attention that would follow in 2016 and beyond. Undoubtedly, Peterson's rise to mainstream recognition came through his strong opposition to Canada's Bill C-16. Now, while unfortunately hate speech legislation is becoming common throughout the West, back in 2016, this was the first step towards the grim future, with the bill looking to add gender identity and expression into Canada's protected classes. Peterson on his YouTube channel would rightly argue that with how vague and subjective something like gender identity is, especially among leftists, that seeking to codify such into law would eventually lead to something like refusing to use someone's preferred pronouns to affirm their identity being classed as hateful and therefore a crime.
To your objection to using pronouns?
Well, I think it's been made clear in the presentation so far is that it depends on which part of the Ontario Human Rights Commission's policies you read. And that's a big problem. I mean, that's one of the reasons I criticized this to begin with, was because when I went through the policies, I could see that they're absolutely incoherent. So, for example, here, let me give you another example. So there's an insistence in the Ontario Human Rights Commission that sexual preference is an immutable phenomenon, which indicates, at least in principle, that it's biologically grounded. But by the same token, in exactly the same policies, they presume that sexual identity, and gender expression are entirely independent. It's like, sorry guys, you can't have both of those because one's A and one's not A, and you can't put those together. And like, there's endless numbers of places in the policy surrounding Bill C-16 that are characterized by that kind of logical incoherency. And I mean, what's it going to...
This would garner Peterson a lot of attention, appearing on Canadian news channels, the Canadian Senate, and marking his first appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, which would be one of the first sparks to ignite the so-called intellectual dark web. Peterson's opposition to this bill would arise at the perfect time, as 2016 was the height of the pre-2020 culture war. While the culture war today is much more complex, split between numerous factions like communists, social democrats, neocons and dissident right, back in 2016 it was more the social justice left versus anyone who opposed them, with an honourable mention to the emerging alt-right. But this opposition faction included a wide array of people such as classical liberals, i.e. lefties who just think leftism has gone too far, libertarians and neocons. Peterson, being a credentialed professor standing up to what was in fact an ultra-woke bill, would garner huge interest and support from the anti-SJW crowd. Peterson would make appearances on numerous podcasts, talking to figures like Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, and now infamously H3H3. All of these appearances would further blow up due to his reputation and allow Peterson to show more of himself than just his opposition to Bill C-16. His knowledge of philosophy, use of psychology, and strong self-improvement message would resonate with many, in particular young men. It's hard to overstate just how famous Peterson became in 2016, and I think in many ways his trajectory mirrored that of Donald Trump. What was a truly anti-establishment, controversial and visionary force in 2016, showing a dogged opposition to the left, providing hope in the sense of Trump's opposition to both neocons and the left, and Peterson's message to young men that not some inherently evil force as the system would have them believe. Throughout the years, both men's reputation would lower and message become more diluted, until now in 2025, they're just simply glorified neocons who shill for Israel, almost completely abandoning their once powerful message. Another quick note on something that I'll delve into much later. A lot of Peterson's work related to the Bible, and in a positive way. He at least presented himself as a Christian in numerous debates, and while it's fair to say that he never outright expressed his faith in Christianity, I think ostensibly put himself forward as one, which sucked in thousands of people to believing he was actually Catholic, which all of course came crashing down in 2025. Another early sign of weakness in Peterson's armoury was his first debate with Sam Harris, where the two men got stuck on what is the meaning of the word truth for over an hour, which completely ground the conversation to a screeching halt. This was a sign that behind the sophistication, there was an over-reliance and sophistry when Peterson got stuck in a tight spot.
The only final way of sorting out whether a scientific claim is sufficiently true is through Darwinian means.
because I think that the Darwinian process is the only way of adjudicating truth. Now, you don't accept that, and that's fine.
I agree about the non-utility of playing fatal games, right? So we don't want to play games that will get us all killed reliably. Certainly if there's no huge benefit on the other side.
Well, from a scientific perspective, why not?
But then you're just saying that, is there a scientific reason to want to exist, or to want your kids to live happy lives as opposed to die in their sleep tonight?
Yes, that is partly what I'm saying, yes.
We can talk about that, but it seems to me we can't just skip over this question of truth, because it anchors everything else any other claim we're going to make.
But another thing to do would, look, fair enough, and we could argue about it for quite a while. And I think the danger is that we'll sidetrack the entire conversation doing this, and that won't be so useful. So what I would recommend is that we could recognize for the moment that we're starting with different claims of truth.
But I don't think we are. I think you're simply deciding at the end of the day to say that any truths that led us down a path where we suffered unnecessarily or died weren't true.
Right. You have to choose what you mean by true. You have to. And I'm not accepting the same definition of truth that you operate under, and it's partly because I believe that Darwin trumps realism, let's say. I believe that pragmatism trumps realism.
Jordan would capitalise on this massive success by releasing a book, 12 Rules for Life, which would become a huge hit and bestseller. I remember getting the train home from work in 2017, and I'd see a few people openly reading it. The book essentially lays out 12 rules for life, which if followed would put someone maybe who's down on their luck on the path to a better life. Each rule is backed up by biological, philosophical and biblical evidence as to its efficacy. The successes of the book would result in Peterson again doing the podcast and news circuit, appearing on multiple platforms to discuss the book, most of the time under friendly circumstances before an infamous interview which would serve as a huge win for Peterson, as well as the new alternative media space, the Cathy Newman interview. Cathy Newman from Channel 4, who can best be described as the most stereotypical legacy media gotcha interviewer, would sit down with Peterson in early 2018 to discuss his book, Bill C-16 and topics like the gender pay gap. This interview just showed off how impressive Peterson was and stands in stark contrast to how he conducts himself today. Throughout the interview he showed the appropriate level of aggression, with a sly smirk on his face, paces his responses perfectly and uses the appropriate tone in response to Newman's bizarre interviewing tactics. Throughout the interview Newman uses the most ridiculous strawmans, metaphors and rephrasing to convert Peterson's words into something supposedly offensive. She completely missed the point of Peterson's example of the lobsters in Rule 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back, which is quite humorous.
The lobster. Tell us about the lobster.
Well, that's quite a segue. Well, the first chapter I have in my book is called Stand Up Straight with Your Shoulders Back, and it's an injunction to be combative. Not least to further your career, let's say, but also to adopt a stance of ready engagement with the world and to reflect that in your posture. And the reason that I write about lobsters is because there's this idea that hierarchical structures are a sociological construct of the Western patriarchy. And that is so untrue that it's almost unbelievable. And I use the lobster as an example because the lobster, we divulged from lobsters in evolutionary history about 350 million years ago, common ancestor. And lobsters exist in hierarchies, and they have a nervous system attuned to the hierarchy. And that nervous system runs on serotonin, just like our nervous systems do. And the nervous system of the lobster and of the human being is so similar that antidepressants work on lobsters. And it's part of my attempt to demonstrate that the idea of hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do with sociocultural construction, which it doesn't.
Let me just get this straight. You're saying that we should organize our societies along the lines of the lobsters?
I'm saying that it's inevitable that there will be continuity in the way that animals and human beings organize their structures.
She tried to make it out like Peterson was telling women not to even try and succeed, for stating that there will always be legit reasons for the gender pay gap.
It's absolute all-out warfare.
Is gender equality a myth?
I don't know what you mean by the question. Men and women aren't the same, and they won't be the same. That doesn't mean they can't be treated fairly.
Is gender equality desirable?
If it means equality of outcome, then almost certainly it's undesirable. That's already been demonstrated in Scandinavia. Because in Scandinavia...
What do you mean by that? Equality of outcome is undesirable?
Well, men and women won't sort themselves into the same categories if you leave them alone to do it of their own accord. I've already seen that in Scandinavia. It's 20 to 1 female nurses to male, something like that. It might not be quite that extreme, and approximately the same male engineers to female engineers. And that's a consequence of the free choice of men and women in the societies that have gone farther than any other societies to make gender equality the purpose of the law. Those are ineradicable differences. You can eradicate them with tremendous social pressure and tyranny, but if you leave men and women to make their own choices, you will not get equal outcomes.
Right, so you're saying that anyone who believes in equality, whether you call them feminists, call them whatever you want to call them, should basically give up because it ain't going to happen.
Only if they're aiming at equality of outcome.
So you're saying give people equality of opportunity, that's fine.
It's not only fine, it's eminently desirable for everyone, for individuals and for society.
But still women aren't going to make it, that's what you're really
It
saying.
depends on your measurement techniques. They're doing just fine in medicine. In fact, there are far more female physicians than there are male physicians.
And most notably her ridiculous point regarding a trans person's right not to feel offended. Peterson's reaction in response to this went viral. It was perfect in many ways. The sheer contempt, but composure and professionalism in which he completely rebukes this point by Newman was impressive and won Peterson even more fans, myself included. And yet again, this is in stark contrast to how we probably react now.
Move on to another debate that's been very controversial for you. And this is, you got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No, that's not actually true. I got in trouble because I said I would not follow the compelled speech dictates of the federal and provincial government. I actually never got in trouble for not calling anyone anything.
Right.
That didn't happen.
You wouldn't follow the change of law, which was designed
not
to
once it was
outlaw
law.
discrimination.
No.
Well,
that's what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on. And that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me, you have got me.
This interview currently stands at a staggering 50 million views, and in the aftermath, Newman played the victim, claiming she was being harassed online, something which was commonplace when a mainstream media member got trounced in a debate back in the day. During the period in around 2017 and 2018, a sort of clique emerged of various apparent intellectuals who had all gained widespread attention for their opposition to the social justice mafia. This de facto group consisted of the likes of Sam Harris, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, the Weinstein brothers, Joe Rogan, Christina Hoff Sommers, Gad Saad, Dave Rubin, and Douglas Murray, among some others. These people would all appear on each other's shows and podcasts and discuss culture war issues, each episode being labelled as a big pushback or dissent to the prevailing issues of the time. This group, due to Eric Weinstein and an article by journalist/Israeli agent Barry Weiss, became known as the intellectual dark web. These guys were hugely successful at the time and really capitalised off so many people's desires to see a real intellectual pushback to leftism that wasn't in the vein of the old Rush Limbaugh Republican types. It really seemed back then that the anti-social justice faction was winning the culture war. YouTube was absolutely littered with videos where someone from the IDW would destroy their left-wing counterpart in a debate. Sacred cows of the establishment such as transgenderism were being attacked. Radical Islam was being dissected from an intellectual standpoint, and any notion of the revival of the Soviet Union communist project was utterly picked apart. Despite the apparent winning of the pre-2020 culture war, the IDW would prove utterly powerless and ineffectual over the coming years, most notably in 2020 when the iron fist of the establishment came bearing down. The iron fist in the form of COVID restrictions, mass censorship of the right, and Black Lives Matter. The issue with these guys is, despite the name intellectual dark web, this was no dark web of ideas. The real dark web would be a sort of mix between big accounts on Telegram, the sort of leftists that even Hassan Piker finds extreme, and intellectuals in the vein of like Ted Kaczynski. In other words, people whose ideas, right or wrong, are actually opposed and a threat to the system. If you look at the IDW, with the exception of Shapiro, they're all classical liberals. They're not opposed to liberalism, just arguing that it's gone too far. They all believe in colourblind meritocracy, the free market, are against nationalism or any sort of unity based on identity. Ostensibly atheists in favour of a secular government, they believe the world order that emerged post-World War II in the West is good, and most damning of all, they're in total agreement on one main issue: Israel and Zionism. So tell me, looking at all these guys' values and beliefs, how are they ever going to be a threat to the system? Instead, they're more of a fishing net, keeping disenfranchised young men from finding nationalist and anti-establishment movements online. Even the book publisher Penguin, who released Peterson's latest book, defended him, stating that he in fact keeps people away from more extreme right-wing movements. As my fellow countryman Keith Wood said, Peterson's entire political career is advocating against postmodernism, when he in fact is a modernist. The failings of modernism is what created the nihilism and devastating force that is postmodernism. 2019 saw the first real signs of cracking for Jordan Peterson. Up until this point, he was imperious in debates, had a strong, clear message for young men, and although I previously argued he had a sort of gatekeeping effect on the right, he did put many others onto Jung, Solzhenitsyn, Western history and Christianity, and from there a more radical outlook was possible. Unfortunately, and almost very similar to Donald Trump, the tentacles of neoconservative ideology started to wrap around Peterson, distorting him from what was the original goal. All of a sudden, videos of Peterson doing interviews with Charlie Kirk, appearing at Turning Point USA events, and constantly arguing for the morality of capitalism became widespread on YouTube. Peterson's criticism of Marxism was no longer really based in critiquing the fundamentally flawed and evil underlying ethical backbone of the ideology, merely how it failed in the face of US capitalism, human growth statistics. He became a sort of talking head for TPUSA and basic Reagan free market neocon neoliberal talking points.
And no one really knows what to do about it. But criticizing the entire society, I mean, the thing about the West, and this is increasingly true all over the world, is that our approach generates a tremendous amount of wealth.
For everyone.
I mean, it even happened in China, despite their exceptionally totalitarian leanings. And so what happens with the lefties is that they say, well, inequality is a consequence of the West and a consequence of capitalism, which is a palpably false claim. And they say, well, because it produces inequality, then it's a corrupt system. It's like, no, every system produces inequality, but hardly any also produce wealth.
That's correct. And mobility, and reward for creativity, entrepreneurial activity, and risk-taking.
From this clip, Peterson is not wrong in the sense of capitalism's ability to generate material wealth, but that's not the issue. Everyone nowadays has a Netflix account, a flat screen TV, an Xbox, and can at some stage afford to do some travelling. Yet our birth rates are collapsing, suicide and drug use rates are rapidly growing, people are unhappier than ever. For all the material wealth that the system that Charlie Kirk and now Peterson argue for, it's hollow in the absence of genuine belief in God and true purpose. It was almost astonishing to hear the man who blew up in 2016 now heavily arguing for this ideology. Most of us aren't opposed to capitalism, but this uncontrolled free market version that is seemingly the only basis for the Republican and TPUSA ideology has resulted in so much damage to the fabric of society. Look at something like OnlyFans, for example. Many companies are now more powerful than countries. Big tech can freely buy up all their competitors and censor dissenting thought on the whims of someone like Mark Zuckerberg. Palantir can get in bed with government officials and now effectively create a surveillance state in the US. Being opposed to communism does not mean you have to stand for this. A seminal moment in the beginning of the decline for Jordan Peterson was his debate with so-called Marxist Slavoj Žižek. Žižek presents himself as a Marxist philosopher to be somewhat provocative. However, he does not advocate for the sort of system the Soviet Union had, nor what brain-dead people like Hassan Piker advocate for. While he is a leftist, he is one of the more interesting ones, looking deeper into issues such as human happiness, progress and freedom than the average Marxist. And this caught Peterson out in their 2019 debate. Peterson, who was fresh off TPUSA speeches, was now a victim and parody of the very culture war he was so heavily involved in, being completely stumped by Žižek, not being some simple college student communist that he was more than used to debating. Instead, Žižek went to places that I'm sure Peterson had no idea the debate would go, such as freedom as a concept being a burden to humanity in the sense of tyranny being produced by the free market. Žižek talking about how the system incentivizes certain desires which may actually be contrary to our own happiness and meaning.
In our daily lives, we pretend to desire things which we do not really desire, so that ultimately the worst thing that can happen is for us to get what we officially desire. So I agree that human life of freedom and dignity does not consist just in searching for happiness, no matter how much we spiritualize it, or in the effort to actualize our inner potentials. We have to find some meaningful cause beyond the mere struggle for pleasurable survival. However, I would like to add here a couple of qualifications. First, since we live in a modern era, we cannot simply refer to an unquestionable authority to confer a mission or task on us. Modernity means that, yes, we should carry the burden, but the main burden is freedom itself.
Think of the person who studies and works their life away to become a director in the Big Four. Is this really a good life? Yes, they'll be rich, but at what a cost to their family, leisure time, and sense of real self-worth. The ideology espoused by Charlie Kirk and these other Republicans is that if everyone just got up early and worked their socks off and slapped an American Constitution on the wall, society would be great, which is completely out of touch with how some of these office jobs are complete meat grinders for the human spirit. This is the pitfall that Peterson himself fell into in 2019. An interesting excerpt from a book I'm currently reading by the late Pope Benedict touched on the meaning of woe to the rich in Luke's Gospel. The Pope said that this is not a condemnation of wealth, but rather a warning to those who live an arrogant material life in the absence of God and Spirit. Unequipped to delve deeper into the debate to counter Zizek, Peterson defaulted to compliments and sophistry, something that would become commonplace for him in the years to come.
You're a strange Marxist to have a discussion with. And, well, but here's why. This is not an insult by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was looking at your work was that well, first of all, you're a character, you know, and that's an interesting thing. Like
Is this an insult or not?
It's not an insult. It's a sign of originality, and it's a sign of a certain amount of moral courage, and
It became beyond obvious in the year 2020 that the intellectual dark web was a sham and completely inept to tackle the crisis that the West is facing. Along with the aforementioned issues that they essentially agree on the same fundamental values, they're also extreme gatekeepers, considering they market themselves as a dark web of anti-establishment ideas. Where is the conversations with Richard Spencer, Peter Brimlow, Nick Fuentes, even people on the far left? I'll even have a conversation with an Islamic extremist in favour of a caliphate, but these conversations never happened, simply because the IDW would lose these debates every time. IDW members pale in comparison to the vision of a true reactionary anti-establishment figure, whether that be on the right or the left. In an age of collapsing birth rates, secularism, suicide and drug epidemic, and demographic replacement, someone arguing in favour of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, free markets, and 1960s liberal values would lose out every time to someone with an actual vision. Not only would they lose, but it became too apparent that, like the very leftists they argue against, the IDW were not willing to engage with figures whose opinions they deem as deplorable. Look at the Groyper War, for example, where anyone associated with Nick Fuentes was banned from any mainstream conservative event, and Sam Harris torching his friendship with Joe Rogan because Joe has people on he doesn't like.
Joe Rogan Podcast is not a substitute for the Wall Street Journal or the Kennedy School at Harvard. It is simply not progress to have a comedian like Dave Smith, who's apparently done his own research, interviewed about the history of the Middle East or the war in Ukraine.
Or the recent despicable appearance by Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan's podcast, arguing that Joe should only have experts on to talk about issues like Israel.
I'm an expert on this, and I have views. Two, I'm a comedian.
I've never claimed to be an expert on anything.
This is the problem, Joe. If somebody
Wait a minute, you have to claim to be an expert on something to have an opinion on something?
You don't.
But you're not even talking about specifically on what he just said. What's the solution? To not talk about it?
No, it's to have more experts around.
During all of COVID, I will put my track record against any of the expert class on COVID. So should I have just shut up? Should I have shut up by opposing lockdowns and opposing vaccine mandates and talking about the lab leak theory?
At the time. You realize
that's the entire argument that you're making. Let the experts handle this.
Not. Isn't it weird to be simultaneously saying I'm not an expert on a conflict and talking about it everywhere?
Do you talk about these things?
Some of them, yeah.
Are you an expert?
I am on some, yes.
On some,
but you talk about some that you're not an expert on.
What should you do if those subjects get breached?
There's a very clear set of ideas that the IDW did not want to touch. While they're happy to debate college leftists all day long or have Destiny do the rounds, ideas like nationalism, white identity and Jewish control were all steered clear from. A great example of this is when an audience member asks Peterson about his opinion on an Alexander Solzhenitsyn book. Now it's worth noting that Peterson has long stated that Solzhenitsyn is one of his favourite authors and worships his work on the Gulag Archipelago. Now this audience member gives Peterson another one of Solzhenitsyn's book, 200 Years Together, which talks about ethnic hatred the Jews have for Christians and white people, which more than likely caused the Holodomor, where genocide was committed against millions of Ukrainian Christians. The man in the audience asked if the same ethnic hatred that Solzhenitsyn talks about could be at play today. Peterson simply states, "I can't do it," which really speaks volumes. Here's the clip.
On the book by Solzhenitsyn I'd like to get to. Thank you. It's 200 Years Together. Last year a couple started translating it into English and they put it online. I included all the chapters that they've translated so far. As a Jewish American, I think this book is very important for everyone to read. In the book, Solzhenitsyn documents the overrepresentation of Jewish individuals in the NKVD and in Bolshevik leadership. He claims that the ethnic hatred these individuals had for Christians played a role in the Holodomor. Jewish individuals had faced persecution in Ukraine prior to the Bolsheviks' rise to power. These individuals exacted their revenge on the Christian Ukrainian population. The result was the death of 4 million Christians. The line of good and evil cuts through the heart of every human. One cannot simply say a given ethnic group is evil. Every individual must struggle with the good and the evil in their own hearts. That being said, it is important to understand what motivates groups to commit atrocities against other groups, because the previous century has been filled with groups killing other groups. Like the Bolsheviks, Jewish individuals are overrepresented in the ownership and senior staffing. I've got a question. It'll take 1 second. So just like the Bolsheviks, Jewish individuals are overrepresented in the ownership and senior staffing of the U.S. news media. The news media also is inexplicably hostile towards Russia. If the current warmongering against Russian Christians is in any way motivated by the same ethnic hatred that motivated the Holodomor, we must face that truth honestly. So here's my question. If Jewish individuals hated Christian Ukrainians enough to starve millions of them to death, could the same thing happen today? Could Jewish individuals use a position of power to seek out revenge against places like Europe and Russia that have a history of expelling Jews? Thank you again for your work. Just remember Rule 9, it's like, maybe there's something here that you don't know about, And I am trying to just speak the truth.
First of all, I haven't read this book, and I do want to read the book, so thank you for giving me the book.
You're welcome.
I can't do it.
That's okay.
On Peterson's website, he would apparently debunk the far right and Jewish question by claiming how ridiculous it is that Europeans feel proud of their ancestors' accomplishments, as they're not their individual accomplishments, which really betrays his ideology, I feel. You should of course be proud of and want to preserve what your ancestors did, not on an egotistical level, but in the way you're proud when a close friend or family member does something great. I personally feel a great sense of pride travelling around Europe seeing what my brothers and sisters have accomplished. I'm proud of Ireland's contribution to literature, how our independence leaders willingly and knowingly gave up their lives to gain Ireland's independence from the UK, and of course British, French, Germans, Italians, etc. should be proud of their people. This is what real meaning is, what really binds us together. What Peterson is essentially preaching is that I should only be proud of contributing to my country's GDP. Secondly, he talks about the issue with Jewish overrepresentation, which Peterson argues is the result of high Jewish IQ, which has been debunked. I suggest you watch this video by Leather Apron Club for a comprehensive breakdown on the topic. The year 2020 was a real turning point where a huge new wave of young men became radicalised, myself included, and not just down to the COVID restrictions. I myself had retreated from politics, becoming completely disillusioned by the vision that was being pushed by the online right, such as the IDW and Turning Point USA. I'd gone to college, joined a respected company, taken ownership, and it was utterly hollow and empty. If this was all there was to life in their vision, myself and many others wanted out. And then the worm really turned. George Floyd's death was, let's say, accelerated by police officer Derek Chauvin in the summer of 2020, and the world rocked with it. BLM was everywhere for 4 months. White people kneeling in front of black people, rioters burning down cities and tearing down statues of European greats, left-wing politicians supporting Antifa and these rioters. Every sports game had some bit about BLM, with players kneeling and social media flooded with anti-white sentiment. I remember seeing plenty of people on my feed, the same people who shared Jordan Peterson clips years before, now sharing posts saying respectability politics is racist. These riots were simply the voice of the unheard. Call out your friends for making racist jokes, and that our own European history is evil. It had become too apparent for myself and thousands of others. In the wake of this purge, Jordan Peterson and the IDW was utterly powerless. All the while this was happening, something awful was happening to the Peterson family, something which I have great sympathy for, which I expressed in my Ethan Klein video. In April 2019, Tammy Peterson, Jordan's wife, was diagnosed with a rare form of kidney cancer. The doctors had given her a timeline of 10 months to live. Undergoing 2 surgeries and suffering many complications, it looked pretty dire for the Peterson family, and this took a massive toll on Jordan, who had previous issues with his own mental health. In response to the extreme stress, Peterson began taking benzodiazepine. When he tried to taper off, suffered extreme withdrawal symptoms, such as suicidal thoughts and akaesthesia, a condition where it feels like insects are constantly crawling on your skin. For better or worse, Jordan's daughter Michaela and her then husband Andre took care of Jordan's health, first admitting him to rehab in New York where his condition deteriorated, and after exhausting all treatment options in North America, Michaela tried an experimental treatment in Russia, where he'd suffer another setback being diagnosed with pneumonia. This treatment involved something called plasmapheresis, where blood is drawn from the body, plasma is removed, and then blood is pumped back into the body. More controversially, Peterson was placed in a medically induced coma for 8 days and ICU for 4 weeks. Whether this treatment was ultimately what saved Jordan Peterson, or was a glorified science experiment, I can't say. However, it's hard to think that it wouldn't have caused some cognitive decline, especially seeing how Peterson talks these days compared to 2016. It was also during this time where Michaela's marriage to Andre would all but break down, and she would have that infamous meeting with a certain pickup artist. Thankfully, Tammy recovered. She fully embraced Catholicism and began praying the rosary every day, receiving a rosary blessed by Pope Francis himself. On the 5th day of doing this, doctors noticed a marked improvement in her condition, labeling it as miraculous. Tammy now speaks very openly about her faith and is a devout Catholic, which makes it all the more sad that Jordan would continue in his Gnosticism and later pen a paper with a number of Jewish people and Indians claiming the phrase Christ is King is anti-Semitic. Jordan would eventually make a recovery and return on a limited basis to public life in early 2022, doing the occasional podcast with Michaela. As the months passed, he recovered more and started appearing in videos solo, and then in June 2022, another point of no return in the Peterson saga happened. He joined the Daily Wire under Ben Shapiro. This was disappointing for many reasons. Not only is the Daily Wire an agent of Israel, not only is it the definition of the neoconservative establishment, but it signaled where Peterson would be taking his career. He rose to prominence talking about destiny, religion, empowering young men. Now he'd be arguing about climate change, the Democrats, and the Israeli-Palestinian war. He was now just a political figure, a tool of the establishment. There was also a noticeable change in Peterson's demeanour from here on in. The strong, capable and snarling figure that once destroyed Kathy Newman all those years ago was gone. Peterson became known for crying in almost every public interview for quite benign reasons. One example where he tells a Muslim interviewee how some Jewish people called him a rabbi once, or nearly every single Piers Morgan interview. Don't get me wrong, it can be powerful when men cry, but that's because it in of itself is something that is rare, meaning when it does occasionally happen, something significant has happened. Now it's just when some hack celebrity is mean to Peterson. Another huge issue would be the over-reliance on sophistry to dig himself out of a hole. I'll post these clips for reference.
You know, so people say to me, what do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? What do you mean God?
These next years, and in particular after October 7, 2023, saw Peterson betray many of the causes that made him famous, that being his advocacy for free speech and young men. Peterson would go on a social media crusade to remove anonymous accounts from social media so people would face real consequences for their beliefs, something you think he'd actually be harmful to the young men that he once advocated for.
And the malignant narcissists are also disinhibited online.
Yeah.
Right, which is a huge problem, right? None of our evolved mechanisms for keeping malignant narcissists under control are operative on the social media. And then you have the subclinical criminality, which are the troll demon types. And then they're monetized by the social media platforms. I've been trying to I've made a case on social media multiple times that platforms like Twitter, for example, should separate the anonymous people from the real people. They should put them in different categories.
Right.
Because if you can't bear responsibility for your words, you shouldn't be allowed free reign in the realm of discourse. And the reason for that, people say, well, anonymity protects freedom. It's like, no, if you took 100 anonymous troll demons, one of them is a whistleblower and the other 99 are malignant narcissists.
His daughter Michaela would argue that Twitter needs to moderate speech in response to an account pointing out that all the major porn sites are run by Jews. He would even recently appear on Joe Rogan, warning against Joe platforming the likes of Ian Carroll, because apparently the dark triad psychopathic types gravitate towards anti-Israeli views.
And the issue is, how do you identify the psychopathic pretenders? And it's even worse now, and then make a barrier, right? Now, the right was calling for the left to do that for decades, and they didn't, and they couldn't, and the left is not good at drawing barriers, partly temperamentally. The right is somewhat better, but there's no shortage of monstrosity there. The problem is that 4 to 5% of the population, something like that, is cluster B, that's the DSM-5 terms, histrionic, narcissistic, antisocial, psychopathic, or they have dark tetrad traits, they're Machiavellian. They proclaim moral virtue. Yes. Doesn't matter whether it's right or left or Christian or Jewish or Islam. They invade the idea space and then they use those ideas as false weapons to advance their narcissistic advantage. Yes. And so then you have the problem. And the right's going to face this more and more, particularly because the left had to face it when they were in powers. Yes. How do you identify the psychopathic parasites, 4% of the population, who are clothed in your clothing,
not naming any
waving
names,
your flags?
Now, to borrow from my countryman Keith Woods again, there is a study from Sweden pointing out how these dark personality types gravitate towards left-wing extremism in search for power. But the logic is pretty easy to see here. The far left, take Antifa or Hassan's base for example, can commit and advocate for violence in the open to crush their enemies, and they get rewarded for it, gain social credit, given power. Peterson tries to apply this to the far right, not taking into account the sacrifice people make. Sam Aliyah being jailed for years for putting a sticker on a lamppost, Nick Fuentes having his bank account frozen and being put on a no-fly list, Dries van Langenhove facing criminal charges in Belgium over a meme. If you're a psychopath seeking power, stay away from right-wing advocacy. Instead, Peterson warps this study for his own ends and in the name of Israel. The worst betrayal, however, is Peterson's abandonment of his original cause, that being to empower young men. The best example of this is his treatment of the likes of the Groypers and Nick Fuentes. Peterson now refers to men on the far right as rats and psychopaths constantly, calling Nick Fuentes lower than a rat. I thought these guys from Peterson's point of view could be classed as, young men spurned by society who have fallen down a dark path. Then why not talk to them rather than insult them? No one said Peterson will have destiny on, a left-wing atheist and sexual abuser, but not someone like Nick. He's had multiple conversations with Benjamin Netanyahu, probably one of the most evil men of our generation, responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. But young men posting memes and criticising Israel are the unredeemable psychopaths. Finally, I'll touch on Peterson's Christian grift and Gnosticism. Now, to be fair to Peterson, he's never claimed to be a believer in God nor Jesus. However, if you're a casual viewer of his, you'd be right in thinking the opposite. Many times he presents himself as a Christian in debates, incorporates the Bible into his works constantly, and even released a new book called We Who Struggle with God. Worth mentioning that the book deals with the Old Testament entirely and doesn't touch the New Testament.
Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem.
Right. That's called a precondition, Douglas.
You don't get the idea of war being no more, or peace breaking out among nations, unless the word goes out from Jerusalem. Yeah. You can have one, but you can't have it without the other.
That's right. Yeah. All right, sir.
Peterson uses the Bible as a sort of practical rule set for life. He also recently appeared on a channel called Jubilee, a debate channel where it was titled One Christian versus 20 Atheists, which had its title changed to Jordan Peterson versus 20 Atheists, in which Peterson was representing Christianity. When one of the speakers asks him if he's Christian, Peterson obfuscates and refuses to answer the question, which rightly puzzles the atheist, who rightly argues that this is the whole reason why they're there. Peterson devolves into some sophistry, calling him something, and the kid replies back, well, you're a whole lot of nothing.
Aren't you?
Sure.
All right. Are you familiar with their doctrines?
Somewhat.
Okay, you're
Their
familiar.
doctrines are very
how do they
deep.
regard Mary?
Why are you asking me that?
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either you're a
'cause I
Christian
won't
or you're
talk
not.
to you if you're a smartass.
Oh, either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing. Right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
To absolutely round off this farce, Peterson would pen a paper with a number of Jewish and Indian writers in 2025, making the case for how Christ as King is anti-Semitic. What can you say about this other than it's a complete and utter betrayal of his base, and more poignantly the belief system that comforted his wife in their most darkest moments? And there we have it, not a video I ever would have imagined myself making. I had a great admiration for the man Jordan Peterson was prior to 2019, a great sympathy for what he endured in 2020, but now what has he become? An agent of a genocidal force, an enemy of any real anti-establishment faction, and someone who would rather now insult and banish disenfranchised men than help them.